Hi, and welcome back. In this next two videos, we're going to be having a look at trigger finding. In this video, I'm going to explain how to do it, and in the next video, I'm going to actually show you an example of me finding a trigger with a client. So let's just do a quick summary. If you remember this, the emotion curve with the threshold and the triggers. And what happens is some event happens, it pushes our emotions up, hits the threshold springs the emotions even higher, and then we come into the calm down phase. And once the threshold is breached, it creates a trigger, and this first trigger is called the primary trigger, or T1. And then every time we kind of think about the issue, or we ruminate as it's known, we start adding more and more pre-triggers to it, and some of those can go back months. Now, each of the pre-triggers is actually an emotion. It's a feeling that gets closer and closer towards the threshold, or the T1, the primary trigger. So the thing that we're going to be focusing on for finding triggers, and the most reliable way of finding triggers, is to skip up the pre-triggers from going right back, increasing the intensity incrementally, getting closer and closer to the primary trigger and the threshold. And then what we're going to do is trigger the primary trigger. Now, the primary trigger will then create exactly what it says. It'll recreate the exact emotion again, and the individual will get the whole thing as if it was the very first time. Now, this is important. Now, what happens is most people, as they kind of are going through the process, they start to avoid the primary trigger, so you'll get them closer and closer and closer, and then what you'll find is they're getting, or you will get closer and closer and closer, and then you'll skip over the primary trigger and suddenly end up in this strange place where there's no real feeling, nothing's happening, and it feels like you've failed. Well, you haven't. You just need to go back and go slower again. So we're going to have a look at this very shortly, and I'll explain with an example, and then we'll move on to the next video where you'll actually see it happening in practice. Once you've found the primary trigger, it has two effects. Firstly, it makes the whole thing not as scary, and what we see over time is just finding the primary trigger actually starts a process of dishabituation. And the fear of whatever the issue is lessens considerably at that point. Now, the primary trigger usually is something that's unusual. People don't expect it normally. It's not what they think it is. And you'll see on the next video, and you'll also see in the example that I'm about to tell you. The other thing is that once we know exactly what the primary trigger is, we know precisely what we're going to dishabituate. And it makes the whole dishabituation process a lot quicker. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, I had a chap on one of my live workshops who'd come along. He was a diplomat, actually. He worked in a South American embassy. And his presenting problem was social anxiety. He was really scared of social events, particularly where he wasn't using his expertise. So he was okay if he went, and he was an agricultural attaché in London, and he was okay if he went along and was talking about tractors and farms and things like that. But if he had to make small talk, he got very, very anxious, to the level that it was making him ill. Physically ill. He had a skin condition, and also starting to feel sick, and he used to avoid them like the plague. Now, one of the problems that he had was that every year all the South American embassies get together for a party. It's held in one of the High Commissioner's houses, so it's quite a high-profile affair. Everybody's expected to attend because they're representing their own embassies. Anyway, so that's the background scene. That's as he presented it. So I asked him a few questions, And the questions were, okay, so when was the last time that this happened? And he explained the previous year. And I said, right, okay, so what's before the actual event, when do you actually start feeling nervous? And then his reply was about 6 months before. I was quite surprised at that. And I said, well, what do you mean by 6 months before the event? He said, well, what happens is that the events are usually held towards the end of summer, when it's kind of starting to quieten down. And they, what they do is that the invites start to come round from each of the embassies. So it's not just one party there'll be an invite from every embassy, so there'll be a party in every embassy. He says the invites start to arrive around about February. He says he knows what they are because he's been there long enough. They arrive in a particular heavily embossed envelope with the embassy's crests on them. He says it's the only time that he ever gets mail from the other embassies. And you can feel the card. It's usually very well done, nice heavy card inside. He says the first one arrives in his inbox at his desk, and it creates a small amount of anxiety. Now this is a pre-trigger. So what happens is, rather than open it, he puts them in a pile on the window ledge next to him until he's got all of the cards that he's expecting. Now, so we've got a pre-trigger here, and the pre-trigger is the card. It creates a level of anxiety in him. He actually feels it is a small spike. So I can now play that back to him, and I say, okay, so you're sat at your desk and you're working away, and the mail arrives, and you notice one of these envelopes in the mail. What happens? And immediately he says, I get this little jump in my stomach. That's a pre-trigger. It's a typical pre-trigger. So then I say, okay, so what happens next? So what we're doing is we're marching closer towards the trigger in time. He says, well, the next thing he does is, once he's got them all, he collates them all up, and he spends a few minutes one morning putting them all into his diary for the end of summer. So he opens Outlook, and he puts them into the calendar. It's a 3-line whip. They've all got to attend. So he puts them into the calendar. I say, okay, so you sat there, you've opened them all up, and you put them into the calendar. How are you feeling? And his reply was, I feel sick. So this is the second pre-trigger, and it's slightly more intense than the first one, which is actually seeing them arrive. And then I say, okay, so what happens next? He says, well, nothing for months and months and months, unless he happens to open that week because he's putting another event in and he sees it, then he'll feel a jump in the stomach. Again, typical pre-trigger stuff. Okay, so what's the next thing, I ask? And he says, well, the next thing really is about a week before the event. Now, because the way that he works is he's always a week ahead. He prints off the diary for the next week, so makes sure he's got the driver. He knows exactly where he's meant to be going, and he's got exactly what he needs with him. He's always a week ahead in his planning. He says, so what happens is he'll open up on the Monday of the previous week. He'll open up the next week's to plan that week, and he'll see in there the first of these sessions. Now, what happens then? I ask. He says, and then he gets another lurch. Okay, here's another pre-trigger. Then I say, okay, so what happens? He says, well, I email the driver saying that I need, and what time he wants picking up. And I say, what happens then? He said, well, all that week, so this is the week before the event, so we're actually 2 weeks away from the event because they're usually on a Friday or a Saturday. He said the week before the event, he feels anxious and nervous. He's finding it hard to focus on his work, and again, typical pre-triggers. I said, okay, so let's bounce forward into the week that the party's going to be. What's that like? He said, well, Monday's all right. Don't feel great, but Monday's all right. Tuesday is getting a bit worse, finding it hard to concentrate. Wednesday is really difficult. Thursday, and this was interesting, he said on Thursdays he's really just pushing paper around and not really focusing, and he makes sure he doesn't plan any meetings on the Thursday or the Friday before these events. So this is a severe case of what would be termed social anxiety. Then what happens is that on Friday he knows that he won't be able to cope. Usually these things are on a Friday night. So what happens then is he takes the Friday off. And so I said, okay, so how are you feeling? It's Friday morning, how are you feeling? He said, well, I wake up, actually I don't sleep very well the night before, so I'm not sleeping. I wake up in the morning, or I get up in the morning, and I just feel sick. I can't go to work, I really can't face work. So I take a day off, and then so I say, okay, so what do you do? He ends up walking around Hyde Park or somewhere, just feeling ill all day, frequenting coffee shops and things, just anything to take his mind off it. These are all pre-triggers. Okay, so what happens next? He says, well, the evening comes around. Usually I'm picked up around about 7 or 8 o'clock by the driver. So what happens is I'm in the flat waiting. So now I'm slowing things down because the triggers are going to start appearing quite quickly. Okay, so just before that, what's your routine for these parties? He said, well, I'll go and have a shower. I'll leave my tuxedo out because they're formal events. He lays his tuxedo out on the, say, right, stand there, see the tuxedo. You're about to go to a party. How do you feel? Now, if you remember, what happens is the torso is a little but like a barometer. Low grade anxieties tend to be down in the pit of the stomach, and the closer somebody gets to the threshold, usually what happens is it gets higher and higher up the body. And when people are about to hit the threshold or the primary trigger, they're usually feeling it in their neck, either because the neck's constricting or they're feeling sick or something like that in the neck. So going back, you've got the tuxedo lying on the bed. Look at it. How are you feeling? I feel sick. Where do you feel sick? I feel sick in the stomach. So it's starting to increase from the lower grade things of earlier in the day. Is now in the upper stomach. Okay, what do you do next? So I'm going to have a shower. How are you feeling in the shower? Actually, I feel a bit better in the shower. It always feels better. So that's good. That's not a trigger in itself. It's always calming him down. Come out. What happens next? He said, well, I come out, get dried, put my tuxedo on, and I'll check myself in the mirror. How are you feeling? Really anxious. Okay, where are you feeling it? Right at the top of the stomach. Feel a bit sick. And now I'm pacing around the flat waiting for the driver. Okay, so what's the next event? He says, well, now I'm starting to hope that the phone rings and that they cancel it. This is typical avoidance behaviour, or that something's happened and the whole thing's been cancelled. Okay, well, it's not. So be in the flat. So you go into the situation, be in the flat, and what happens next? Well, the driver arrives. So you see the driver. You see the driver? No, he rings up on the intercom. So be there and hear the buzz. And as he heard the buzz, his body gave a little jerk, and that's a trigger. What's that like? He said it's awful. It's like this sudden rushing up into my chest. And as I say, the body's like a barometer. We're getting closer to the trigger. Okay, so what happens next? Well, I go downstairs and I get to the car and the driver opens the door. How are you feeling? It's really sick. It's in my chest now and a little bit in my throat. Okay, closer to the trigger. So what happens next? He said, well, we drive to wherever the embassy, whichever embassy it is, or the ambassador's house. How are you feeling during the drive? He said, just generally sick in the throat and sick in the stomach. I'm hoping that there's an accident and we just can't go, or the car breaks down or something. Again, avoidance behaviour. And then, okay, so now I'm bouncing forward in time a little bit. So just go forward a bit in time and you're arriving. So what was the last event you went to? He said, yeah, got it in my mind. said, okay, so what happens? He said, well, what happens is the drivers all drive up and they're coming from all over London, and they get in a queue at the ambassador's house, and then they drive. You're not allowed out until you get to the front door, and somebody at the door will open the door for you and you get out at that point. So you've got to wait there. And he said it's a bit like being on a cart waiting to have your head chopped off in the French Revolution. He said, I just feel ill. And as the car inches forward, it gets worse and worse. And this is typical. It's getting worse and worse. It's getting higher up the body because he's getting close to the trigger. So I say, okay, right, the car's arrived at the front door. Just describe what's going on. So, well, I'm sat inside. There's a doorman coming to open the door, and there's 4 or 5 steps up to the front door. Okay, so what I want you to do is just be there, be in the car. How you feeling? Where you're feeling it? It says it's upper chest and my throat a bit. So we're really close to the trigger now. Okay, so what happens next? The door opens. How are you feeling? So, well, now I'm worried in case my legs won't carry me and have turned to rubber. Okay, so, and I'm going to have to slow things down here now because we are close to the trigger, and the trigger will be a moment in time, one particular thing, and usually it's very weird. So now what happens is, so what happens next? I get out of the car. Okay, how are you feeling? It says really ill. Okay, so what next? He said, well, and this is what typically happens is people skip over the trigger. He says, well, then I go inside and I'm looking around, and I said, how are you feeling? He said, well, all right, actually. And it's typical, people will skip over the trigger. They're trying to avoid hitting the trigger. So my job is to bring him back. So come back to the bottom of the stairs. How are you feeling there? Ill. Okay, good. Right. So just take the first step. How are you feeling? Worse. Right. Where is it? It's in my throat. Oh, we're really close to the trigger now. Take the next step. How does that feel? Worse. And every step we take gets worse and worse and worse, which is good news in one way because it means that we're still on the way into the trigger. So I've got him on the top step. He's now on the top step. And I'm saying, right, okay, what do you see? He said, well, the door's there and it's closed. It's protocol that I knock on the door and the door is open for me. I said, right, okay, how are you feeling? He said, really ill. My throat's dry and I feel like I'm going to have to be sick if you don't hurry up. Okay, so knock on the door. Now, first I'm thinking maybe the knock on the door is the trigger. But he knocks on the door. How are you feeling? He said, still sick, so it's not the trigger. So what happens next? He said, well, I go inside, I take my hat and my coat off, and you can hear the way that people talk. He's just skipped over the trigger again. I bring him back, and this is typical. They'll skip over the trigger 2 or 3 times, and you'll have to slow the time down. So what happens next? Okay, he said, well, the door opens. Okay, how are you feeling as the door opens? He said, really ill, like really, really ill. And if you don't stop this, I'm going to be sick. So I said, no, hold it. It's all right. So I went back and shut the door again and slowly opened the door. And we were stood in this classroom, no door, it was a pretend door. And I started to open it, slow time down, started to slowly open it. And I noticed that he was looking in through the non-existent door. And I said, how are you feeling? He said, really bad, really, really bad. So I opened the door a bit more and a bit more, inch by inch, and it was getting worse and worse. So we were really close to the trigger because he was holding his throat. He felt sick in his throat. And then he looked up at the person who was opening the door and suddenly jumped. And I said, what happened there? And he said, I don't know. And it turned out that the trigger was when he goes to any event, and it includes parties with friends and things, where he doesn't feel certain about what he's talking about, and he's knocked on the door and the host opens the door or somebody opens the door and he sees their eyes, that was the trigger. And somewhere in his head it's like the point of no return, he can't get away. And So what he thought was a social anxiety turned out to be a trigger of the person's eyes opening the door. And once we'd found it and dishabituated it, he was fine. And he went to all sorts of parties after that. Anyway, you're going to see this in action in the next video, where I help somebody who's got a needle phobia. And we find the trigger for the needle phobia. And she actually described it as white coat syndrome. But you'll see what happens, and you'll see what the trigger is. And if you remember, as you go through the next video, that the trigger very rarely is the thing that the person thinks it is. Okay, that's the end of this video. Go on to the next video and watch a live case of trigger finding. And oh, one more thing. If you need help with your triggers, just click on the button below, and I can help you finding your trigger. Okay, take care. Bye.